Now, let's rewind us even further back. I'm going to take us to your next article. American students barely know anything about Reconstruction. Again, it's and Rotimi, just let me know that my camera's off. We have two different cameras, guys. So funny enough, he couldn't see me, so I was like in the shadows for him.
Like, who am I talking to?
Yeah, he couldn't even see me, but I as long as all the fans can see me. But funny, we did go to the same school, so again, looping back to saying like education, the vital piece of connecting the dots of our history and to today, Reconstruction. You have a quote. I'll read the quote in the here. Quote, concerningly, an Illinois middle school teacher stated in a report that looks at education standards for American history that Reconstruction is generally the most skipped and summarized unit in the history curriculum. Okay. What is Reconstruction? And why do you feel, and why is it something that is overlooked in American history?
So, listeners at home, for context, the Reconstruction era is the period following the Civil War. So after the Civil War happens, we have a bloody Civil War. It's awful and terrible. President Lincoln realizes, obviously, that we just had a really tough time in our country. We need to do something to unite everyone back together, one, but also two, we now have a lot of people that are new citizens, Black Americans, given the fact that the North, won the Civil War. So we need to figure out how to really make them a part of American society. So what the president does, he really meets with his team and decides that we're going to put together this plan to make sure that the country unites together. So as the plan starts to come out, you have Southerners get really, really frustrated, and they start to fight back. And this is actually, a lot of people don't realize, is when the Ku Klux Klan was invented. What happened was, as the North began to build out its plan for Reconstruction, and Abraham Lincoln started to build out his plan, he then is assassinated. And then you have Grant becomes president. And as this plan is being implemented, the Ku Klux Klan starts going around the South, terrorizing Black families as they start to vote and get jobs. And Grant has to send troops down to the South to quell the Ku Klux Klan. And he's genuinely fearful that another civil war is going to break out. So then what happens at that point is then another presidential election. And the person who is supportive of Reconstruction is essentially barely gets enough votes to win. And what happens at that point is they have to broker a deal to win, to say, oh, if you end Reconstruction with the opposition, if you end Reconstruction, then you can become the president. So the president, I believe at the time it's Rutherford B. Hayes, makes that deal and decides that Reconstruction ends. So the reason why I think it's such an important piece of history to learn, it's because it's a pivotal moment in American history where one election really changes the course of American history. I think we could sit here and pontificate forever about what would happen if Reconstruction didn't end. Maybe we'd have a more unified country, and maybe a lot of the social ills that we see happening to a lot of Black communities wouldn't exist because the government have actually reunified the South after the Civil War. I mean, we can sit here and talk about that, but I think the bigger point is it shows how one election has serious consequences. I think it also shows how our country has truly, after the Civil War, some of the problems that we had back then are still problems today. Issues around voting, issues around election results, issues around, what it means to be an American, who can we call an American, issues about what rights do states have are still issues that we're talking about today. So I think it's extremely important for this topic to be talked about in schools, because there's so many places you can talk with students about how it relates the past and the present and even the future. So I wrote this article the weekend of Juneteenth because I really wanted people to understand that, even people that weren't in school anymore, that this was something they should really learn about. And For listeners at home, I'll recommend it's a report by the Zen Education Project. I have it right here because I was actually reading it before we got on. It's called Erasing the Black Freedom Struggle, How State Standards Failed to Teach the Truth About Reconstruction. And it does a really deep dive into our education system and talks about the places that were going wrong in teaching history. And to relate it back to what Connor and I were talking about, what we're seeing at our old school where they're banning books, is they're obviously not teaching Reconstruction. And it concerns me that you're going to have a crop of students graduate that are going to be missing out on vital history lessons about America's past. Because, if we don't teach students about the past, they'll probably go wrong in the future because they won't know the mistakes that our country made in the past.
Absolutely. And not to fully give a correction here, but when Lincoln was assassinated, I believe it was Andrew Johnson that
Andrew Johnson. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for correcting me on my history, man.
I just wanted to throw that out there because it's important in noting that I believe Andrew Johnson was a Democrat and and Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, and they had and Lincoln was given Johnson basically as the vice president to kind of form this alliance. And that was the initial undermining of Reconstruction was Andrew Johnson fighting against the quote radical Republicans at the time.
Yes.
Which this is why it's such an interesting period in thinking like, okay, like all this stuff's going on. You have Grant, who was the general for the Union at the time, coming later. So like all this stuff intertwining. But just like that was the initial undermining was with Andrew Johnson. And just a quick note in noting that the radical Republicans of the time were the most like liberal people in the country, not the most conservative people in the country. So just for those watching and listening that people want to Dinesh D'Souza it and say that the Democrats were the this, that, and the other thing.
Yeah. If I could say something about that, I think definitely. When I hear that, I think it's the funniest crap that I think I've ever heard. It's the most uninformed and uneducated take. It shows that people haven't read history and learned the basic facts about kind of what's happened in our country. Like, have they ever heard of party realignment? Have they ever heard of the fact that when Lyndon Johnson, as you said, when we passed the Voting Rights Act, he knew that this would change politics forever, and that when that happened in that moment, so many legislators in the South that were actually Democrats were like, oh, we're going to become Republicans now because we want nothing to do with Democrats because they've essentially passed a bill like the Voting Rights Act that would protect the voting rights of Black Americans. So, people should do a little reading. That's all I'll say.
Yeah, and it's like, look, if you don't understand it, or like nobody taught you that, like, this is what this is for. These are what these conversations are about. It's saying like, don't just buy into saying like, oh, Democrats this, Republicans that. Like, go look up the Whig Party. Like, go learn about these parties that don't exist anymore. That the Democratic, I think it was the Democratic Republican Party, but I think the names could have been switched. Like, these parties over the time that we've had the two-party system were just evolving constantly, and they're evolving right now. So just don't take things so face value to anybody that's listening or watching. But I do have a quick question before we move on to the last article. And it kind of coincides with some of this school board stuff. But how do you feel that educators can teach about the Civil War and the Reconstruction era while pushing back against the false narrative of it being labeled as critical race theory, or like, kind of falling under this? I think that's what a lot of folks are afraid of in being educators. I mean, I think that seems to be where people, it's like the same thing with sex education and teaching, being like in the gay straight alliance, right? These things like that are not harmful are being labeled as something that is harmful. Yeah. So like, I guess, what do you have like maybe a way that we can kind of frame this era in a way that's like avoiding that label? I mean, maybe it might still get labeled that, but it's just a question that I genuinely wanted to see what your thoughts were.
Well, I think the unfortunate thing is no matter what, when I say we, I mean like good intentioned people to
Yeah.
try to tell truth about history. So I'm including a lot of teachers that want to tell the story, writers, kind of whoever. No matter what is said, it will be misconstrued by bad actors who want to essentially just control what's happening. They don't really have an agenda. All they want to do is control. So I think the only thing we can do as people like this is continue to tell the truth, but then also be aware that there are people acting like this. So even before detractors make comments saying that, oh, this is not wrong, or this is wrong, excuse me, this is incorrect, this is biased, this is critical race theory, already being prepared to come back and say, no, it's not, here's why. And being already ready to respond, I think, is the best thing we can do, because those people, they want to control. That's purely what they want to do. They want to control what's happening in classrooms, they want to control what's happening outside of classrooms, they want to control everything. There's really no agenda if you listen to these people. And when they have an agenda, it doesn't make any sense. So that's kind of my thought, is just really being ready to respond to detractors when, they say bad things.
Yeah, it's an unfortunate reality, I think, of the current situation that we find ourselves in, because I think even myself, like, I find myself more and more fascinated with that Reconstruction era as time goes on, because I feel like we're almost in like a repeat in some fashion, and a repeat of like the 1960s era, which I guess is like 100 years after Reconstruction.